This is the point in which Arkansas goes from being the leader of integration in the Jim Crow South to the road to Central High in 1957. And so after the Southern Manifesto, the conversation changes from, this is a decision we don't really like, but there's nothing we can do about it, we might as well make the best of it, to how do we organize to stop this from happening?
You're listening to The Underview, an exploration in the shaping of our place. My name is Mike Rush, and today we're asking some deeper questions about how race, labor, and the pursuit of civil rights have shaped not just our history and our region, but how they continue to impact everyone's ability to belong. These issues, labor, race, and belonging, they are so tightly woven together and so politically charged that it's often hard to separate historical fact from ideological spin. But if we want to understand the story of Northwest Arkansas, we have to be willing to ask who worked, who benefited, and who was excluded. In a place where indigenous removal and the enslavement of people created the first foundations of wealth and political influence, what happens when the demand for cheap labor continues long after those systems have formally ended? How do new sources of labor get recruited and constrained or discarded when they're no longer useful? And how does a society justify these patterns economically, morally, and politically? Today's conversation is with Dr. Michael Pierce, an associate professor of history at the University of Arkansas. He specializes in the ways that a coalition of labor and civil rights groups brought New Deal and Great Society-style liberalism to the state. This conversation today takes us back through the often overlooked history of Northwest Arkansas as a region once alive with anti-corporate radicalism, union solidarity, and interracial organizing. That was before the rise of concentrated economic powers reshaped our civic institutions. Together we explore how Jim Crow, disenfranchisement, and racial expulsion weren't just acts of exploitation. They were economic strategies designed to divide working people and preserve the privileges of a few. And we ask, what does that mean for us now, in a region where wealth and poverty live side by side, where immigration is more codified and controlled, and where corporations shape our civic identity? How do we understand who gets to belong? Are race and labor still being used together today to determine whose lives are valued and whose labor is expendable? We've got a whole lot to work through today. Let's get into it.
Well, I have a privilege today of sharing a table with Dr. Michael Pierce, who's an associate professor of history at the University of Arkansas. Dr. Pierce, thank you for coming, and thanks for being a part of this conversation.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm always happy to talk.
Thank you very much. I know your specialty is in modern U.S. labor and race issues here in Arkansas, and I'd love to understand a little bit of your background and what brought you to this topic.
Yeah, I moved to Northwest Arkansas, to Fayetteville in 2000. I was 35 years old, and I had never, ever stepped foot in the state of Arkansas until I moved here. My partner, my spouse, got a job teaching at the University of Arkansas, and we were an academic couple, and I was the redheaded stepchild of academia, the trailing spouse. And I'm a trained PhD in modern America. And what happened is the history department here put me to work teaching the classes that they needed to be taught. And those were Arkansas history. The state had just passed a law requiring all elementary education and social studies education people to take Arkansas history, and they needed it. And this really kind of aligned with my interests. My first research project was focused on the community I lived in, Ohio. And so once I got here, the questions that I had as a historian were informed by what I saw in just living. I wanted to know the history of the place in which I lived.
And I have an affinity for this. So that's I love hearing that. I love hearing that.
Yeah. And if you're a U.S. historian and you're in Arkansas, why study the Pacific Northwest or why study South Carolina when there are things here? This place has a history that matters. And it's my curiosity, it's my professional work, it's who I am. And so I just started teaching Arkansas history, and I published some stuff from my earlier work, and it's time for a new project, Arkansas history. And so I've been teaching Arkansas history for almost 25 years now at the university and been publishing for probably the last 15, 18 years. And I'm a labor historian by training. I study working people, especially how working people mobilize to express their sort of collective needs, whether it's in the political arena or the economic arena. And so once I started turning my scholarly attention to Arkansas, that's what I looked at. And what shocked me more than anything else, I'm from Ohio. I am from a big labor state where the Ohio AFL-CIO is a powerful organization. And moving to the South, the Sun Belt, I just assumed that there was not much labor organizing, or not even much what I call anti-corporate radicalism. And what I found in the Ozarks and what I found in Northwest Arkansas and Western Arkansas was a tradition of pro-union, anti-corporate radicalism. And it's not necessarily confined to what we call Northwest Arkansas today, but it is all throughout the Ozarks and even the Ouachita Mountains. If we look down at Fort Smith has a long history of worker activism, of labor unions, of fighting for what they see as the rights of workers. And my interest in Northwest Arkansas actually started looking at things that were happening in Sebastian County, most famously in 1913 and 1914. There was a coal miners' strike in southern Sebastian County. And basically, it was a fight between the United Mine Workers, local citizens, local law enforcement against company goons and U.S. Marshals. It was basically a civil war down in Sebastian County. And it was seen as local officials, the sheriffs of these small towns and these small communities, they sided with the strikers. The bankers in these small communities, the physicians sided with the strikers against these outside forces. And there was this profound and deep suspicion in the Ozarks and the Ouachitas of outsiders, of the concentration of economic power in the hands of a few. There was a defense of what were seen as prerogatives of working people and their families. This was profound. The strike I was talking about in Sebastian County, court cases from it made their way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And there was a decision in the early 1920s. And the Chief Justice, William Howard Taft, of all people, Taft said, "I've never seen anything like this, where a town, a whole community came out in support of a union and workers." He says it's unprecedented. And that's happening in Western Arkansas. Just a few years later, during the Great War, during World War I, there was a general strike in Fort Smith. The Trade and Labor Council just simply shut down the town after the Board of Trade basically had a legal coup to remove the pro-union mayor of Fort Smith. And the Trade and Labor Council said, this is not what democracy looks like. And they launched a general strike in December of 1917. And it was designed to help striking telephone operators. And the telephone operators were employees of the largest corporation in the world at that time, AT&T or its predecessor, and they went on strike demanding that the state minimum wage for women law was enforced. They were asking for what the state guaranteed them. And what we're seeing but in Sebastian County is part of a larger culture in the Ozarks, in the Ouachitas, of suspicion of the concentration of economic power, vigilance to making sure that the rights of working people are respected. And this is all throughout the Ozarks. In Madison County, Sam Faubus, Orval's father, he was a radical socialist, and he ran the Greasy Creek local of the Socialist Party of America. One of my favorite sort of stories, maybe facts, is that the most powerful women in the Socialist Party of America in the 1920s all came from one town in Sebastian County, Arkansas, a town called Huntington. There was a woman named Frida Ameringer, or Frida Hogan before she got married, who was considered for the vice presidency of the Socialist Party of America in 1928. There was another woman, Bertha Hale, also from Huntington, who ran the Socialist Party during the 1924 election. And it's this radical, pro-worker, anti-corporate. And I want to make it clear, these people were not, when they were socialists, they had no problem with mom and pop businesses. They just didn't like monopolies. They didn't like the concentration of economic power in the hands of a few people who could use that to push down wages, to make life difficult for working people. And like Sam Faubus was a socialist. The people down in Huntington, Arkansas, were socialists. Many of the strikers in Fort Smith in the 19th were socialists, but socialism for them was simply the idea that the concentration of economic power in the hands of a few people is dangerous, and that the government should be used to curtail the abuse of that power. And whether that means the collective ownership of railroads and natural monopolies and utilities, so be it. One of the other things about this, you can see these ideas in the utilities around here. The electrical co-ops, they were a product of this vision. They were a product of the New Deal. And it is the New Deal that brought electricity to Northwest Arkansas, outside of the towns. You tell people Bentonville, Arkansas, it has a municipal electrical utility. This is what they used to call gas and sewer socialism. This is a legacy of that tradition. And that tradition was extremely powerful, whether it's in Harrison, whether it's in Greasy Creek in Madison County, whether it's in Fort Smith. Northwest Arkansas was not as industrialized as many areas of the state, especially Fort Smith. But there was still a powerful union tradition here. And the place I work, the University of Arkansas, there was a powerful union of workers in the 1960s. AFSCME Local 965. And what AFSCME Local 965 did is they launched the first public employee strike in the South in the ever. And they won. And when they went out on strike in 1963, they had the support of the town and the community. It was this legacy, as I said, of suspicion of the concentration of economic power. It's a vigilance of looking at the rights of working people. It's everywhere.
Dr. Pierce, one of the things like this situation you're talking about, Sebastian County, for example, this is representative of a time, and this is representative of an area, correct?
Yeah, there's a historian by the name of James Green, and he talks about this entire area from southeastern Kansas and parts of Missouri down through Oklahoma into Texas and Louisiana and Western Arkansas as being this home of this grassroots socialism. And it's not the socialism of the Europeans. It's a socialist tradition that comes out of an American tradition called producerism. And it's this idea that the world is divided, not between the owners of the means of production and those who sell their labor, but between those who produce wealth and parasites who live off the wealth produced by others. And so as part of this tradition, it's a 19th century tradition. It's rooted in ideas of Jefferson and Jackson. And what they said is that the people who mix their labor with the earth produce wealth. A farmer mixes his or her labor with the land, and they produce a crop, and that is of a value. A blacksmith mixes his labor with ore and coal and produces something of wealth. And what these grassroots socialists from this region said is that after the Civil War, parasites, people who didn't work, people who didn't mix their labor with the land, were the ones profiting from economic growth. And farmers and working people were struggling. And what these people, historians of labor, call them producerists. And what they argue and what they say is what has happened is that these parasites have corrupted the government. They have abused their power. They've created monopolies. And that in order to free the producers, to the people who actually work, that the monopolies have to be taken over by the government. And that they have to be natural monopolies, things like trains and things like utilities. They need to function to serve the people rather than greedy private interests. And so it's this grassroots socialism grounded in this sort of anti-monopoly tradition, grounded in what people have called the labor theory of value, grounded in these 19th century ideals that a working man should enjoy the fruits of his or her labor. And by the late 19th century, early 20th century, people around here, they looked and they thought, we're working harder every year. We're planting more crops, but every year we're getting poorer and poorer. And the people who we see who own stock and run banks, they're getting rich. They're getting rich off the labor of other people. And so what these grassroots socialists that were all throughout Northwest Arkansas, but also the broader region, what they were saying is that government had to be restored to help working people enjoy the profits of the goods that they produced.
So when we talk about like the frameworks of our municipalities, and we talk about, to your point, the example of utilities, for example,
yeah,
this is an intentional decision by those municipalities to concentrate things like power, for example, not like power in the clouds, like power, like literal power, like electricity. This is an intentional formation to make sure that these things serve the people that are there and that need these in a way that they can't be taken advantage of. Is that my understanding?
Yeah. And utility companies are the primary example of a monopoly. Yeah, you can't have 7 utility companies selling electricity in a town. It just is economically inefficient. In the American political tradition, there's a deep suspicion of monopoly, or at least there used to be. It's kind of gone by the wayside. And that if you have a monopoly and you can only buy your electricity from one place, that one place has power over you and can use that power to extract wealth from you that is unjust. And that is the thinking that permeated throughout this region. The most important politician before Orval Faubus was brought up on this.
Dr. Pierce, can you help us, let me set the framework a little bit? If I understand correctly, that kind of early 1900s, 1920s, 1930s, what's the political framework that we're kind of operating in? And what's the racial dimension of how that works as well, too? This was predominantly a fairly white space, obviously a history of segregation, but how does that enter into this mix of the conversation?
Yeah, this is going to be a detour, and I hope I don't go too far. Segregation, Jim Crow, the separation of races in public life, and disfranchisement both come to, disfranchisement is policies that make it more difficult for working people, poor people, to vote. And since African Americans tended to be poorer than white people, disfranchisement disproportionately affected African Americans. But in Arkansas, disfranchisement was about, it hurt both Black and white people of modest means. And so disfranchisement and Jim Crow come to Arkansas in the 1890s. And what had happened, what caused this to come about, is that in the 1880s, there was the makings of a biracial alliance of working people, of farmers, of people who worked for wages in towns and cities. And in the 1880s, farmers, upset with declining crop prices, the rates that railroads charged them, the banking system that was deflating the currency, they were attracted to something called agrarian radicalism. And they demanded a series of changes. They wanted ownership of railroads and telegraphs. They wanted to reform banking. They wanted to create inflation. They wanted to make it so that they could enjoy the profits from their labor. And agrarian radicalism in Arkansas was basically institutionalized by an organization called the Agricultural Wheel. And the Agricultural Wheel, it was formed in eastern Arkansas over in Prairie County, but it had affiliates all throughout the Ozarks and the Ouachitas in the west. And what the Agricultural Wheel does is by late 1880s, it forms a political party called the Union Labor Party. And the Union Labor Party and the Agricultural Wheel were both biracial. They had Black locals and they had white locals, and they were addressing the needs of poor, humble farmers. And by 1888, the Republican Party in Arkansas, which was composed of mostly humble Black folks, formed a political alliance to try to remake the state, to challenge the prerogatives of the Democratic Party, which was led by the state's economic elite. And there was, in 1888 and 1890, a series of elections that were characterized by violence and fraud. Ballot boxes were missing, they were stuffed, they were disappeared. At one point, a congressional candidate, a guy named John Clayton, was assassinated by Democrats in Conway County. And the Democrats, by the early 1890s, decided winning elections through violence and assassination and fraud is dangerous. We need to get a better way to make sure that the economic elite stay in power. And that's when Jim Crow was introduced. It was a way to separate Black folks and white folks in public life, to make the sort of biracial political coalitions of poor people impossible, or at least difficult. And so the first Jim Crow law was in 1891. Representative from Fayetteville down in the General Assembly introduces a bill to require Black folks and white folks to ride in separate coaches. His name was John Tillman. He later becomes president of the University of Arkansas and a congressman representing this area. But this, by the same token, disfranchisement And in Arkansas, disfranchisement took a couple forms. Disfranchisement was never as absolute in Arkansas as it was, say, in Alabama or Mississippi or South Carolina. But the institution of a poll tax, the complicated procedures that go along with that, new balloting procedures that made it difficult for people who were not the most literate to vote, centralizing control of the counting of ballots within the Democratic Party. All of these things disfranchised poor people, more disproportionately Black folks than white folks, but it hurt. Disfranchisement reduced the number of humble white people voting and the number of humble Black people voting. And what we see is, I tell my students, if racial separation was natural, you wouldn't need to create a law in 1891 mandating it. And that in Arkansas, segregation, disfranchisement were tools that the economic elite used to keep working people, Black and white working people, separate, to prevent a biracial working class challenge to the prerogatives of the economic elite. And what the coming of Jim Crow does is it really increases racial tensions all throughout the area and all throughout the state. Starting in the 1890s is an increase in lynching, and an increase in night riding, which is basically warning, usually African Americans, that they need to leave. White workers see Black folks as economic competitors. And as opposed to before the 1890s, they were economic allies. After the 1890s, they become economic competitors. And night riding was a way to drive away lower-waged Black workers. And it becomes really complicated. In Arkansas, more that Jim Crow and disfranchisement were put in place from above by the economic elite for their benefit. And they set working class Black folks and working class white folks in many ways against each other. There are exceptions. One of the great exceptions is the United Mine Workers of America. Believe it or not, the United Mine Workers of America used to be extremely powerful in western Arkansas, especially south of the Arkansas River. And the United Mine Workers of America was the most inclusive union in the late 19th, early 20th century. The joke was, when you're in the mine and you're dirty and you don't have enough light to see, everyone's the same color. And so these mining towns, a lot of times operators would introduce Black workers as strikebreakers. But in these mining towns, a lot of these strikebreakers just said, no, we're not going to do that, and join the unions. The other thing that you see happening in the Ozarks is racial cleansing. Many Arkansas towns become sundown towns. They become places where African American people cannot live. Once the sun goes down, they're expected to leave town. By the First World War, by the Great War, there were 3 towns in the Ozarks in which African Americans could live. A community in Fayetteville, a small one in Bentonville, and also Eureka Springs. But other towns, including Cotter, including Harrison, they had episodes in which Black folks were expelled. One of the other places where Black folks were expelled was a town in Sebastian County called Bonanza. And what is the United Mine Workers of America are putting out leaflets saying, no, our members, you should not do this, that we need to think of Black working people as our brothers, not as our competitors. And so down in Bonanza, it's the United Mine Workers that are saying, no, we can't do this. But expulsion is just, it's horrific. The Ozarks in the 19th century had a larger population than the Black population than the Ozarks in the early 20th century because of expulsion. The most famous case is Harrison, but lots of these small towns all the way across North Arkansas and down the western border, racial expulsion. But a lot of the boosters in these towns actually used racial expulsion as a way to grow. In the teens or the 20s, I forget which, Springs Board of Trade, its booster organization, would run ads in regional papers, say, move your company to Salem Springs because there are no mosquitoes, there's no malaria, and there's no Negroes. Actually, they didn't use the word Negroes. And so this is part of this Northwest Arkansas tradition, that this racial expulsion happens. African Americans continue to live in rural areas. There were communities, especially in Madison County, that trace their lineage back until before the Civil War. Okay, I know I keep on talking and not giving you time to ask questions.
No, it's number one. I think this dimension that you're adding is really, you may not have the benefit of this, but I look back at some of how this fits into some surrounding conversations.
Yeah.
But to me, from what I'm hearing from you, like in that, is that the racial dimension was weaponized against poor Black and white communities.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's the wealthy class that's doing that as a way of.
Yeah. In areas in which African American labor is not critical to the welfare of the economic elite, what is expulsion? That the town leaders, if not encourage it, they tolerate it. In places like in eastern Arkansas, where the economic elite is utterly dependent upon cheap Black labor, there's not expulsion of Black folks. And what I'm trying to get at is...
But other means are used to control.
Oh, absolutely. Right. There's different types of racial violence, including, most importantly, lynching, which is a community-wide. Lynchings are rituals, usually led by the town's elite, that help solidify white solidarity. It's us white people beyond class acting together. Night riding, which is also seen in the Delta and other areas, is signs of disagreements amongst white people based on class. That working class whites are angry with Black competitors, but also the people who employ them. And so night riding targets are sometimes Black folks and sometimes the economic elite. And this happens in the Delta, but it's in the Ozarks and the Ouachita, where Black folks are not a necessary part of the labor force, just in sheer numbers. Racial violence plays out differently than it does in the Delta.
Yeah. Gosh. It's hard to hear you say that as clearly as you did.
It's hard to say it as clear. It's just different. Folks in Northwest Arkansas have, today, I'm talking about today, tell themselves certain stories. And some of those stories are that slavery in the Ozarks was more benign compared to slavery in the Delta. That Northwest Arkansas was at the forefront of school integration in the 1950s, whether it's Fayetteville being the first high school in the Jim Crow South to publicly integrate, or the University of Arkansas integrating in 1948, or Bentonville High School in 1955. And so did Lincoln, and Charleston and Van Buren started integrating, and Fort Smith made this effort to start integration early on. And people in Northwest Arkansas, they know all of those things. And those are the stories that they like to tell. The stories of that Northwest Arkansas is different than the rest of the Jim Crow South. But it's the stories that they ignore. The stories like Nelson Hackett. The stories of what slavery looked like on the ground in Northwest Arkansas. The stories of racial expulsion throughout the Ozarks. The story of Archibald Yale Boulevard being placed where it is to cut off Black community from the core of Fayetteville. The stories of what life was like in Fayetteville for Silas Hunt and those other first students, or the fact that Fayetteville, this progressive bastion, didn't integrate its elementary schools until threatened with legal action in 1965, a whole 11 years after the Brown decision. And so people in Northwest Arkansas have a selective memory when it comes to race. And one of the things that I think is important for historians to do is to suggest to people that they have a more realistic understanding. Yeah, it's great that Fayetteville High School was the first high school in the Jim Crow South to publicly integrate. But there were problems, that these things are messy processes with good people and bad people. And it's not a simple story of good versus evil. It is a story that is complicated. People are both good and not as good as you would hope. And we need an honest reckoning with race relations in Northwest Arkansas if we want to move forward in a way that is helpful for everyone, rather than this is my vision of what things should be and I am going to stick by it. But the honest conversations like you're doing are necessary for this place.
I would say thank you. I think this is the reckoning that we're trying to understand. That I could probably talk about this all day long, but I'm here to ask you questions. But I think this is part of the process, right? Is that if we can come to terms with an honest history of where we're at, then maybe there is a way to move forward together in a way that maybe is whole. Well, we're getting to that. Dr. Pierce, thank you. I think that for me, that framework is incredibly helpful to try to think about our past history, which is not something we spend much time doing. And so for some people, this could be brand new information or maybe framed in a way that they're not expecting, but I think it's necessary. And so I'm grateful for that. Let's go back to this conversation because you're painting a picture of economics and race and labor and all of these things, and really painting Northwest Arkansas as this place that the term you use, these anti-corporate radicalism and labor organizing places. But that's not where we are today.
Yeah.
Where did this shift start to happen, or how do we get from there to maybe bring us a little bit more forward in history here?
I often answer that question by pointing to Orval Faubus. Faubus is a product of this anti-corporate radical past. He was born in Madison County around 1911. His father, Sam, was a dyed-in-the-wool socialist. Orval Faubus grew up in a family in which he was taught that race was imposed by the economic elite to fleece working people. And this is what he was brought up on. He was a humble kid, humble family, and he went to a socialist labor college down south of Fort Smith, not too far from Mena. It's called Commonwealth College. It's a wild place, and he was there, and that's his higher education. And the people at Commonwealth, they worked with the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. They worked with the Socialist Party. They were part of this broader left during the 1930s when Orval Faubus was there. It was a vibrant place, and he was ambitious. He was student body president at Commonwealth, and he went off to war, World War II. He was a little older than most people, and he was politically ambitious, and he started writing back. He had a column in the local newspaper in Madison County, and he came back and he bought the paper. He ran for county judge. He lost. But at this time in 1948, there was this critical election. A guy named Sidney McMath. Sidney McMath was brilliant. He looked like a movie star. He had been a lieutenant colonel in the Pacific during the war. He had every medal you could imagine, and he was a Southern liberal. He's from Hot Springs, and he came back from the war, and he says this politically corrupt machine that is running Hot Springs and allowing this illegal gambling and this prostitution, this is not the democracy I have fought for. And he led what is called the GI Revolt in 1946. It was about liberalizing the South, breaking Southern communities away from boss rule, from these people who controlled votes and would vote hundreds and hundreds of times and stuff ballot boxes. He wanted to bring real democracy to his part of the South. And this is going on all throughout the South, these GI revolts. And in 48, he runs for governor. And he's running for governor in 1948. He's running for the Democratic nomination. And at this time, the president was Harry Truman. And early 1948, Harry Truman issues a report on civil rights. He has a special commission. They issue reports. And what he does, what the report calls for is a fair employment law. You can't discriminate against African Americans for jobs. Integration of the military. Getting rid of the poll taxes that are keeping African Americans and poor people from voting throughout the South. Equalization of spending on education. Fair play for African Americans and Black people in the court system. You would have thought, if you'd listened to the leaders of Arkansas, the governor at the time was a guy named Ben Laney. If you listened to Ben Laney, this was directly from Joseph Stalin himself. This was, and it just would destroy the way of life in Arkansas. And so Ben Laney, the governor of Arkansas, and a lot of other Southern governors led a rebellion in 1948 called the Dixiecrat Rebellion. And they nominated a guy named Strom Thurmond, the governor of South Carolina, to run on this democratic states' rights platform against Truman in the general election. And what these states' rights governors wanted to do was to stop civil rights legislation. They also hated a lot of the New Deal labor legislation. And the gubernatorial primary in 1948, Sid McMath ran. And he says, we don't need federal laws, but if I'm governor, I want to repeal the poll tax. I want to give African Americans fair play in the court system. I want to increase spending on African American education and organized labor. African American groups got behind Sid McMath. His opponent, a guy named Holt, I forget his name. He was a former attorney general, first name. He ran with the support of the segregationists and the business community. By the way, if you had a diagram of the segregationists and the business community, there'd be lots of overlap.
There's the Venn diagram.
The Venn diagram of the two. It's not a perfect circle, but it's close. They got behind Holt, and the election was about labor and civil rights on one side, segregationists and the business community on the other. McMath won. McMath probably lost the white vote, but he got about 90% of the Black vote, or at least the 90% of the free Black vote. And he becomes governor. And he helps Harry Truman win the state of Arkansas in the general election. And you know that picture, Dewey defeats Truman from the Chicago. Arkansas and Texas going for Truman is the reason Truman won. And so, anyway, it is during that 1948 campaign, McMath is traveling around the state, and he meets Orval Faubus. And Orval Faubus becomes one of the most enthusiastic supporters of McMath. McMath running with the support of African Americans, running with the support of organized labor, opposing the business leaders, opposing the segregationists. And it makes sense. This is who Orval Faubus was growing up. And Sid McMath sees Orval Faubus as charismatic, as brilliant, as intelligent. And Sid McMath hires Orval Faubus to be his executive secretary down in Little Rock. This is Orval Faubus's introduction to state politics. He is part of this labor black McMath coalition, and he's good at it. He is absolutely brilliant. In 1954, Orval Faubus runs for governor, and he's very savvy about that time that he chooses to run for governor, because earlier in 1954, Sid McMath announced his intention to run for the U.S. Senate against a guy named John McClellan. And John McClellan was an old-time segregationist, anti-union politician from South Arkansas. And it was going to be handsome Sid McMath with African-American supporters and organized labor supporters, and against John McClellan, the traditional leader close to Arkansas Power and Light and all of these state economic interests. And to prepare for that race, Sid McMath goes to Washington, D.C., and he sits down with the heads of the Congress of Industrial Organizations and the American Federation of Labor and says, I need money to get out the black vote in Arkansas. I need money to buy poll tax receipts that can be distributed to my supporters on Election Day. It was standard at this time that political leaders, political bosses in the counties, and people who ran companies, nursing home operators would buy poll tax by the hundreds, by the thousands, planters. And McMath says, the reason that people who are pro-worker can't win elections is because we don't have any money to buy poll taxes. And so the AFL and the CIO gave McMath thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars. And he works with African-American leaders throughout the state to distribute those poll tax receipts in black communities so that black folks can go and vote. Faubus knows this is going on. And he says there are going to be more African-American voters in 1954 than ever. Organized labor is going to be highly motivated. He says, I am going to ride on Sid McMath's coattails into the governor's office. He goes in, and McMath loses. Orval Faubus wins. And Daisy Bates, in her autobiography, says Orval Faubus won because of black voters and organized labor. And in his early years, Orval Faubus was the most racially progressive governor in the South. In his first term, he integrates the Democratic Party's executive committee. He adds 6 seats for African Americans. During his term, he does nothing to prevent schools from integrating. During his first term, the state's colleges, undergraduates integrate. And by late 1955, a black newspaperman in Little Rock by the name of Ozell Sutton, he writes a article for the leading black paper in the nation, the Chicago Defender. And he says, Arkansas is the one bright spot in the South when it comes to integration. And that's under Faubus's watch. And what happens is Faubus has his legs kicked out from under him. Up through 1950, the Brown versus Board of Education decision was in 1954. Faubus is elected in 54. 55 is a year marked by really profound racial progress in Arkansas. It's led by a set of moderate white politicians. Faubus, Attorney General is a guy named Thomas Gentry. And what these guys say is, look, Supreme Court has made its decision. Segregation is illegal. We might not like it, but we should follow the law. And most people in Arkansas through 1955 were like, yeah, we don't, most white people in Arkansas through 1955 into early 1956 were like, we don't like this law, but it's the law. There's nothing we can do about it. We might as well make the best of it. And what is undergraduate institutions, integrating schools in western Arkansas and northern Arkansas, integrating schools in central Arkansas, taking the first steps, preparing to integrate, school boards working to do the right thing. And then in the spring of 1956, a group of Southern congressmen, including J. William Fulbright, issued something called the Southern Manifesto. And the Southern Manifesto basically says that the Supreme Court was absolutely wrong and suggested if the people of the South rose up, they could stop integration from happening. And what is this sea change?
Well, let me interrupt the conversation for a moment to give a little clarity around the Southern Manifesto. In 1954, just before the Supreme Court issued its ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education, 17 states in the District of Columbia still mandated racial segregation in public schools. 4 more states allowed it locally. As expected, the decision sparked intense backlash across much of the South. The very next day, Mississippi Senator James Eastland declared, "The South will not abide by or obey the ruling." By early 1956, Southern legislators had passed dozens of laws. They were aimed at preserving segregation. Some local governments even closed public schools, rather than choosing to integrate them. Senator Harry Byrd of Virginia called for a massive resistance. Soon after, South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond drafted a formal statement of opposition to Brown, what became known as the Southern Manifesto. Signed by 101 members of Congress, including both U.S. Senators from Arkansas, J. William Fulbright and John McClellan, the manifesto condemned the court's decision as a quote-unquote clear abuse of judicial power. These lawmakers, many of whom once defended segregation under the court's Plessy ruling, now rejected the authority of the court altogether. They claimed the federal government had no right to force school integration. Here's a brief excerpt from the document itself. Quote, "This unwarranted exercise of power by the court, contrary to the Constitution, is creating chaos and confusion in the states principally affected. It is destroying the amicable relationships between white and Negro races that have been created through 90 years of patient effort by the good people of both races." Unquote. This is a chilling reframing, presenting segregation not as oppression, but as peace. And the conclusion of the manifesto makes their intent clear. Quote, "We pledge ourselves to use all lawful means to bring about a reversal of this decision and to prevent the use of force in its implementation." Unquote. This wasn't subtle. These were elected officials across the South, including Arkansas, taking a stand against the Supreme Court, against desegregation, and against the very idea that black and white children could learn together in the same classroom. I'll include a link to the full Southern Manifesto in the episode webpage if you want to read it in full. All right, let's get back to Dr. Pierce.
This is the point in which Arkansas goes from being the leader of integration in the Jim Crow South to the road to Central High in 1957. And so after the Southern Manifesto, the conversation changes from, this is a decision we don't really like, but there's nothing we can do about it, we might as well make the best of it, to how do we organize to stop this from happening? And once all of those Southern congressmen and Southern senators issue the Southern Manifesto, it kicks all of those racially moderate Southern politicians like Faubus in the teeth. They've been trying to thread this needle. They've been trying to make integration work in a non-disruptive way. They want to move forward with progress. And then all of these leading politicians like J. William Fulbright and John McClellan are basically saying, they just kick them in the teeth, that this can be stopped and it should be stopped. And that changes the whole conversation. One of the leading civil rights groups in the state, the Arkansas Council on Human Relations, their director was a guy named Nat Griswold. And he's quite clear. He says, look, everything changed with the Southern Manifesto. It changed the entire conversation in the state. And so what I think happens is that Orval Faubus is backed into a corner. If he wants to continue in office after 56, after the Southern Manifesto, he has to become a segregationist. The ground has changed. The ground has changed. And he adopts, at least in late 1956, a moderate segregationist position. And when he's running for re-election, African Americans and organized labor support him. They're thinking that this sort of is an election year gambit, that he'll revert to form. Anyways, he's better than the dyed-in-the-wool segregationist he's running against, a guy named Jim Johnson, who later became a Supreme Court justice. But Faubus understood the ground, the terrain he was operating changed fundamentally with the Southern Manifesto. And if he wanted to survive politically, he had to become a segregationist. And so Fulbright, whose home grew up right over there, he is the one who's kicked Faubus in the teeth. Yeah.
I think as you lay this out, I mean, that change, like, how do I think about that change other than just the desire to hold on to power?
I think for Faubus, it was definitely a desire to hold on to power. If you had asked in 1955, when the Brown II decision came out, if you would ask any knowledgeable person on race around this country, who is the least likely Southern governor to become the hero to segregationists, Orval Faubus would have been at the top of the list. And so how does he go from being the most progressive governor on race in early 1955 to what he did in 1957? It is just political opportunism. People like Fulbright, I think, were true believers. They believed that, I think, as Fulbright believed, in a meritocracy in which he was on top and that poor people were at the bottom for a reason, and that Black people were at the bottom and poor white people were at the bottom because they weren't as good. And that's the way he thought. So Fulbright was a true believer, but Faubus was never a true believer in anything except his own political career. And he would later say, look, whoever was going to be elected was going to be a segregationist by that time. Better me than someone who actually believes it.
I get my head around that. Yeah. I mean, that's the whole point.
Well, and this becomes just extremely difficult because all of these organized labor in Arkansas had bankrolled McMath. They bankrolled Faubus. They believed that this Black organized labor alliance could bring New Deal style liberalism to Arkansas, could open up the political process, could create fair tax systems, could improve education, could bring infrastructure to the state. And they had invested heavily in Faubus. And when he betrayed organized labor, organized labor was the first civic group, political group, activist group led by white people to denounce him. In early 1958, they denounced Orval Faubus as the enemy of the working people of Arkansas. And the labor leaders had to walk this really fine line because most of the rank and file white members were probably segregationists. The leadership was invested in a biracial political alliance. And so the leaders had to walk this fine line, and they would denounce Faubus as an enemy of the working class, but never mention segregation. And in 1958, when Faubus was running for re-election, his whole campaign was focused on organized labor. And he said that the leaders of the Arkansas AFL-CIO just want to install Daisy Bates as the ruler, the queen of Arkansas, and that they're sending hit squads to undermine me. So Faubus turned his rage in 1958 against organized labor. And in many ways, the people of Northwest Arkansas faced a choice: organized labor, Orval Faubus. And A lot of them went with Orval Faubus. And Orval Faubus proceeds to put together a political machine. Orval Faubus was never an economic conservative. He had a populist strain to him. He believed in generous welfare and social spending. He was also played the race card, much like George Wallace, who was a racist New Dealer. Yeah, and what by the early 1960s is that working class white people have to choose this vision, the vision of the leaders of organized labor or the vision of Orval Faubus. And I don't think anyone got all of the votes, but organized labor was really hurt by this. Labor rebounds by the 1960s and early 1970s. And by the early mid-1970s, organized labor, the Arkansas AFL-CIO, is considered to be the most powerful single political entity outside the major parties in the state. It was organized labor that bankrolled Bill Clinton's 1974 run for Congress in this area. Bill Clinton, in his autobiography, talks, hey, it's the labor people. They gave me all of this money to run television ads and to become this up-and-coming star of a political cartoon from the era. It's Bill Clinton as a little boy carrying a bat, and his bat just says labor. And organized labor made Bill Clinton. Organized labor made David Pryor. Organized labor made Dale Bumper's election possible. They were so strong. By the way, this Black Labor Coalition, it gets kind of disrupted by the Central High crisis and Faubus, but they come back together, most importantly, in the open schools movement, keeping schools open rather than closed to avoid integration. But also in 1964, the coalition comes together and passes a state constitutional amendment ending the poll tax and creating a permanent registration system. The U.S. Constitution bans a poll tax in 1964. In federal elections, Arkansas is the only one of the 6 poll tax states that eliminates it for state elections at that time. And that's largely because of this Black organized labor coalition coming back together and writing this permanent registration law that really opens up Arkansas politics for the first time, that the elite cannot just buy hundreds of poll tax receipts and vote them, that there are very few impediments to people actually exercising their franchise. And what is after that, Arkansas enters into its great liberal period. This is when you have tax reform. This is when you have a minimum wage. This is when you have this whole set of pieces of legislation that regulates banking and it regulates usury laws. And it is legislation that really, for the first time, is in the interest of working people rather than the elite that control the state.
So help me understand, how does Northwest Arkansas, though, become a place where, I don't know that it was the intention at the time, but today we have some of the largest companies in the world.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
why? Is that by chance? What in this trajectory change?
A couple of things. One is these are homegrown companies. They're not the outsiders. In the early 20th century, the concentrations of economic power that people in Northwest Arkansas feared were coming from abroad. New York bankers, Chicago bankers, St. Louis merchants, Kansas. And so having homegrown corporations, it's somewhat different. But the other part of this is what is the weakening of organized labor. The big companies in Northwest Arkansas are all stridently anti-union, proudly anti-union. And the weakening of labor unions in the 1970s, both in Arkansas and across the nation, gave these companies room to grow and sells groceries, pays their workers less than Kroger's, which is unionized, gives them a competitive advantage. Tyson grew, competing against regional butchers and meat cutters, competitive advantage. After the Motor Carrier Act of 1980, trucking companies grew in Northwest Arkansas because, with the exception of Jones and ABF, they were non-union. One of the things that happens is that right after World War II in Arkansas, the politically dominant force were still the large eastern Arkansas planters. It was the utility magnates. Because of mechanization, because of trade, by the early 70s, the economic center of the state was no longer tied to agriculture. And what is the rise of the Stevens and the Dillards in central Arkansas, the rise of the Tysons and the Waltons. And by the 1970s, the economic powers in Arkansas no longer needed Jim Crow. In fact, racism was seen, if you're selling chickens in grocery stores across the nation, being seen as racist is detrimental. If you're a cotton producer, nobody cares. And so this new economic elite has a different business model than the planters that dominated the state in the 40s and the 50s. And this business model did not rely on Jim Crow. And this business model was just as anti-labor as those planters were. And if you're a politician like Bill Clinton, and you got elected to office with this Black labor coalition, they're the ones who funded you. Once you're in office, your political calculations change. You're more interested in staying in office. And the easiest way to do that is to cozy up to powerful economic interests. And so people like David Pryor, people like Bill Clinton, people like Dale Bumpers were elected by this Black labor coalition. Once in office, they cozied up to the state's economic interests. And they pursued politics. I think Dale Bumpers described it best. I am a social liberal and an economic conservative. And so every time, it was a time in the 1970s that companies, including Walmart, were becoming more sophisticated in their union avoidance techniques. And organized labor would go and say, we need a new labor bill that will make it fairer. And the people like Dale Bumpers, like David Pryor, who were elected with the help of organized labor, they just said no. They didn't want to offend powerful economic interests. And so what you see is once these politicians like Clinton and Bumpers and Pryor turn their backs on organized labor, and you can look at 1976 with the repeal of right to work, 1977, 1978 labor reform bill in Congress, you can see it. Once these happen, labor just withers. And since labor was at the center of this coalition, of this Black labor coalition, and labor actually provided most of the funding for it, without labor, there's nothing to prevent, curtail. There's no countervailing force against the power of large economic interests in the state. And so now we have a state government that is largely controlled by financial interests. If you think that's good, great. If you think it's bad, yeah. But you look at the money it takes to run for office. You need 20, 30, $40 million to run for a statewide office, like senator. That can only come from certain people. And once they contribute money, they expect something in return. One of the things I keep getting back to is Walmart right now has a business model. We have to have the everyday lowest prices. To do that, we have to cut costs. We have to cut costs everywhere we can cut costs so we can pass along the savings to the consumer. And that means cutting wages and cutting wages and cutting wages. And Walmart has a business model now that relies on a good percentage of its workers being dependent on SNAP benefits and Medicaid. Walmart is externalizing its labor costs and having taxpayers pick up the tab to the tune, about 10 years ago, they figured it was about $6.8 billion a year. I know that's probably not for this episode.
No, but that's a whole can of worms that.
And if Walmart was unionized, that would not be the case.
Yeah, I'm curious. When we think about these kind of corporate interests, we go from a state that was really pro-labor to a state today that arguably is not. How is that kept in check? Like, how are the corporate economic interests, how does that work to convince workers that they're okay, that it's okay the way that it is?
One of the big things, and this is really since it started probably in the late 70s with the economic crisis, with the high inflation, with the high unemployment, with the high interest rates all coming together in the late 70s. It's scaring people. It's scaring people. If you don't accept this, something worse will happen. And it's getting working people fighting over the crumbs that are left. Scholars call this precarity. You put workers in this precarious situation and use fear of that something worse might happen to keep them from asking for something better. And you see it all of the time. And but the other part is you scream and yell that it's those Mexican immigrants who are destroying your way of life, rather than the fact that the world's largest corporation pays you wages. Sorry.
One of the things I'm always curious about are your fears. When you, from your perspective, and then the conversation that we've had, I'm curious, what are your fears for this place?
One of the things, and this is, I watched the Ozark Studies Association meeting talking about your gravel biking.
Yeah.
One of the things that I do and is one of these middle-aged, older white men who rides bikes every morning. And when you ride on the Greenway in Fayetteville, homelessness becomes legible. It becomes seen. And what we are witnessing is a profound housing crisis. And this housing crisis is also rooted in the poverty wages that so many people in Northwest Arkansas, as we're not building housing quick enough. And that means that the prices of existing housing goes up well beyond inflation, and wages of people are stagnant. And that means that homelessness, hunger, misery are just going to increase. And the homeless, the unhoused encampments in Fayetteville, they're a warning what's going to happen to larger and larger numbers of people if fundamental change does not come. And so I guess that is my biggest fear.
One of the themes that we try to use to string all these conversations together is this idea of wholeness. And I guess my question for you would be, like, within the work that you do, within the way that you see the world, what does wholeness look like for you in this space?
I have to, this is going to sound strange after the conversation we've just had. I can't imagine living anyplace else. I raise kids here. I've lived here for 25 years. It's home. I live in a great neighborhood. I have a lot of good friends. I love my students. And wholeness would mean that everyone in our community would get the advantages and the opportunities I have personally, professionally, family. I have a great life. And that makes me want other people to have those opportunities too. And I see so many people shut out from the life I live. And I'm not one of these close the door behind you. I want to give them a hand up. And so I guess that's my answer to your question.
Yeah, it sounds like wholeness to me. So I will subscribe to that definition any day of the week.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Pierce, thank you for sharing a table with me. Thank you for the work that you're doing. And thanks for helping us understand kind of the long history of how these influences in our state and in Northwest Arkansas impact where we are today and maybe what's possible from here. And yeah, Dr. Pierce, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for being a part of this conversation.
I love having great conversations with people. Thank you for your great questions. Thank you for this opportunity.
You bet. Anytime.
Yeah.
We have to sit back down and have a conversation in a few years to see if we can get a little bit closer to solving some of those housing problems.
I think you need beer at these.
I think we should have, what's the version, drunk history? We'll have drunk underview conversations. Yeah. So I'll probably say a lot of things that I probably shouldn't. So.
I would too.
Anyway, Dr. Pierce, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, incredible thank you, Dr. Pierce. In today's conversation, he helped us recover a story that's long been buried beneath the surface of Northwest Arkansas. A story where working people organized across race and class, where labor strikes and union halls challenged corporate control, and where Black and white communities sometimes stood together until power found new ways to divide them. What we heard today wasn't just a history lesson. It was an invitation to rethink how systems of wealth and race and labor have always worked together, not just to build economies, but to build boundaries around who belongs and who doesn't. We saw how Jim Crow and disfranchisement weren't isolated acts of discrimination. They were deliberate economic strategies designed to break coalitions that might threaten the power of a small few. And we were reminded that what happened here wasn't exceptional. It was part of a national pattern. Dr. Pierce helped us see how this region, known today for big corporate headquarters and rapid growth, once had a very different identity. And he showed us how that shift wasn't accidental. As corporations rose and unions weakened, as labor solidarity fractured and civil rights were reframed, and through it all, the ability to belong, to have enough, to be protected, and to thrive was determined not by justice, but by economic calculus. So where does that leave us now? If the history of race and labor in Arkansas is one of both resistance and betrayal, of progress and backlash, then maybe the task ahead of us is to stop choosing between economic dignity and racial justice, and start recognizing how deeply they're intertwined. As Dr. Pierce said, belonging isn't just about where you live. It's about whether your work is valued, your voice is heard, and your future isn't always at the mercy of someone else's profit margin. I want to say thank you for listening, and I want to say thank you for being the most important part of what our community is becoming. This is The Underview, an exploration in the shaping of our place.